All right, everybody, welcome back. It is Tuesday afternoon. This is going to be your last set of notes for this week. For Wednesday, on the 1970s. Today's topic is going to be focusing mostly on music of the 1970s. Now, you got your music worksheet. A couple of you, thanks for turning that in. The worksheets on some of the songs and stuff from the 1970s already, so hopefully you're working on that. I'm going to go talk a little bit more about some of the various forms and how music kind of evolved or changed during the 1970s. Okay, so let's get into that. So, music in the 70s. Uh, so, during the 1970s, we see more and more of the diversification of the sound of rock and roll music during this time period. Rather, when we're talking about music from the 1960s, we focus largely on, how music evolved from being very simple to very protest oriented and be very message oriented. Music in the 1970s was not as much, certainly not as much protest oriented, as that kind of died off after Woodstock and the early 70s. Probably the last really notable protest song um, of the late 60s, early 70s was the Ohio song that I had you listen to by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Uh, so what we're emphasizing more a little bit when we talk about music of the 1970s is how sound was changing and how sound was evolving. Okay, when rock and roll came out, there was simply rock and roll, use of guitars and drums and stuff like that. It diversified a little bit in the 1960s, getting a little bit faster pace in some cases, getting a little bit more um, folksy in others, and still others you're going to have more of an emphasis on um, electric guitar and bass and things of that nature. In the 70s, that really gets pushed to a new level as we start to see a lot more emphasis on the sound, even more so than the lyrics, right? In prior times, we really had a big emphasis on the lyrics as well as the sound of the music. Uh, we see a lot more diversification going in the 1970s with much more an emphasis on the sound as different subgenres of like rock music, such as um, punk rock, heavy metal, early heavy metal, progressive rock, uh, and other forms. Really, hard rock really evolved throughout the course of the decade, and you can see that play out in the different types of music that developed at this time. Okay, in terms of African American artists, we still see Motown Records as a very, very powerful force during the 1970s. Okay, and really into the 1980s. Motown is the record label that signed acts like Diana Ross and the Temptations and the Jackson Five and Marvin Gaye. Pretty much any big name African American artist was a Motown artist. Uh, so we see the continued growth and popularity of African American groups and artists, like the names I mentioned before, as they continue to become their variety of music continues to become more and more widely accepted and popular amongst the general population, i.e., white people, and so we see their music grows. We also see in the 1970s the rise and kind of fall of disco music. Disco became a craze by about 1974, 75, around that time, and it got white hot in like 1977, 78, before the late 70s, where disco pretty much became like a hated form of music, um, and people just wanted to kind of get rid of their records and all that. So it was kind of a meteoric rise and fall, kind of like a song that's like you guys like is like really hyped for a minute and then everybody gets into it and then suddenly it's not cool anymore, so you hate it and can't stand to listen to it. I don't know what you know different groups and people, whether it's like Taylor Swift or boy bands or whatever that might be. We experience that same thing today. The most notable event of the whole anti-disco movement was 1979, something called the Disco Demolition Night at a Chicago White Sox game. The owner of the White Sox, there was a double header. And in between games, uh, if people could get in for free if they brought their old disco records, and they were going to put them in a big trash can, or I'm sorry, in a big like dumpster, and they were going to blow it up on the baseball field in between the first and second game. And so basically, the stadium gets flooded with tons of people that want to get rid of their disco records. They do this big explosion. There were so many people there. Everything kind of went crazy. And then there was like a crater in the outfield, so they had to postpone the second game. Actually, I think the White Sox had to forfeit the second game. So I'll give you a video to Disco Demolition Night. It was kind of a crazy thing, but it shows you how much people were got just like had it with disco music. Okay, so let's talk about some popular trends in music during the 1970s. We already hit disco a little bit. Um, one thing you'd see that was really popular and drove rock music purists crazy was the growing popularity of what they called big budget arena rock. A lot of rock groups, most notably a group like Kiss and some of the other big time groups from the 1970s, Aerosmith a little bit, and some others, um, wanted their concerts to be performances, wanted them to be experiences more than just the music. So they would bring in like fire and pyrotechnics and big, you know, explosions and things and neon signs and all this stuff. They turned music into just such a spectacle that the purists in rock music during this time thought that it took too much away from the actual sound and the actual lyrics of this music. So there was a lot of, uh, as music still continues to grow during the 1970s and becomes big business, they want to attract people to go see these massive concerts with, you know, 60, 70, 80,000 people crammed into a stadium or into an arena that want to see these massive, massive concerts and these big spectacles. They did one time where they dumped like they had this giant vat of foam and they dumped the foam onto the crowd, you know, and everybody go crazy and that sort of thing. These big time spectacle shows is what um, rock music became really known for during the 1960s, 70s rather. You'd see bands again, like a band like Kiss, where they wear these wild costumes and stuff. All the people that don't like this, they just say it takes so much attention away from the actual music that it's really not even worthwhile. And so a lot of critics were not big fans of these big budget concerts. Another popular music trend during the starting about 1973, 74 is the movement towards punk rock. Um, Again, this was kind of a niche audience. Uh, Punk rock is your version of like 1960s psychedelic rock and music like that, where people, these were like White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane or something of that nature, even Come Together. It wasn't so much protest music, it was the teen angst music of that particular era. People were tired of living within whatever social expectation existed, and their response to this is punk rock music. How does punk rock music stand out? You got an example of there, the Blitzkrieg Bat by the Ramones. Um, it's a much harsher sounding music. It's disorganized and chaotic, just as teens and young people at that time in their lives feel about the direction that the way things are going for them and how big business is overtaking music. Punk rock was stripped down, um, not overdone. Their concerts wouldn't be big spectacles like in a big budget rock concert. They'd be much simpler. Okay, they had their own fashion styles with torn up clothing and jeans and like the leather jackets with pins in them and spikes and things of that nature. That, of course, just like the hippie look from the '60s, becomes a fashion statement, which again goes against probably everything that the punk rock movement stood for. Uh, beginning in the 1970s. And of course, that still exists today in kind of like post punk bands that you have out there, like Green Day or groups like that. We also see a lot of experimentation with music during the 1970s through progressive rock experimentation. But progressive rock is basically is a sound in which you just see a lot of experimentation and trial with synthesizers and different types of music and different types of sound. Some groups you would categorize into progressive rock movement would be a group like Queen. But if you really listen closely to a lot of music from Queen, and I put an example again on your in the music for this week, their sound really differentiates. Many songs from Queen really stand out and are unique, and they have a very kind of there's no distinctive sound that is uniquely Queen because they have so many different sounds that are theirs. They use a lot of synthesizers, or they don't, or they do something like a rock opera, like a Bohemian Rhapsody, or some of the stuff they do later. That's um, a little bit, somewhere between punky and, almost a little bit of like a funk or disco sound from time to time. You see groups like Queen, another one is Rush. You got an example from them too, where you just hear a lot of a very distinctively different sound than normal rock from that particular era. In the late 1970s, we also get the debut of rap music or hip hop. It develops really from kind of dance music or disco music that was popular during the late 1970s. The very first rap song ever was a song called "Rapper's Delight" by the Sugar Hill Gang. Now you might be familiar with the song. It comes out in 1979. We couldn't use it in class because some of the language is questionable, uh, but this is generally regarded as the first ever rap song. Because the song is called Rapper's Delight, that's how the term rap gets associated with the style of music. And in the lyrics, they often repeat the hip hop to hippie to the hippie to hip hop and you don't stop, right? Um, so that's where the hip hop side comes from. But the Sugar Hill Gang, Rapper's Delight, is generally regarded as the first ever rap song. Okay, so who are some of the big names from the 1970s? I know I left some out. I didn't include pop music as much. So you're talking there about people like Elton John and Billy Joel and Rod Stewart and people like that during the 1970s. So sorry about that, you Elton John and Billy Joel enthusiasts. But disco obviously is one, and there's a million disco bands. Most notably, is a group like the Bee Gees. Donna Summer was a big one. The Village People, YMCA, you probably know that song. Gloria Gaynor, I Will Survive. The Bee Gees do Staying Alive and many other songs. So they're one example of disco music. Progressive rock. Some progressive rock groups would be categorized as groups like Queen or Rush, Pink Floyd. Their sound, again, is also very progressive and distinctive for its time period, and also ELO, or the Electric Light Orchestra. All these really popular bands, all four of them bands in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, so they made big time influence. And the music of progressive rock really has a big influence on new wave music in the 1980s. So, and when we get to God bless, I got to stop even trying to do that. So a big influence on that once we get to the 1980s. Okay, punk rock bands. You get groups like the Clash. They're probably the first one. They're actually a British band, so are the Sex Pistols. The Ramones are probably the first great, most notable American punk band. And then you got a group like Blondie. Now, Blondie's actually biggest hits came in the early 1980s, but they fit into this punk rock genre as well. Funk and soul music. You kind of heard that a little bit from Marvin Gaye with What's Going On. Groups like Kool and the Gang, Earth, Wind and Fire, James Brown, of course, the godfather of soul is another example. So you get, funk music, African American led groups generally, and people like Marvin Gaye, James Brown, etc. Then you're looking at hard rock and arena rock. Particularly arena rock, you're talking more about groups like Kiss and Aerosmith. Hard rock, a good definition for them would be a group like Led Zeppelin, who also did a lot of experimentation with sound, but came out with a much faster, beat, with a much faster beat in the early 1970s, a much harder beat using bass guitar, like the example we used of the Immigrant Song. And a group like Black Sabbath is an innovator in terms of heavy metal. And that's Ozzy Osbourne, and he was crazy. All right, so just a couple other things I want to hit really quick here, just for comparison's sake. I want you to look at this. So in the 1970s, music really hits a super peak in terms of its popularity. Record sales in 1973 alone topped $2 billion. $2 billion in sales in 1973. In 1973, at the movies, at box office, only 1.2 billion. Okay, and in ticket sales in sports, we're not even going to talk about sports that much in the 1970s because really, other than football, other than the Super Bowl, the 70s were not a great decade for sports, really, at any level. The NBA almost totally failed. Baseball was losing popularity a little bit. There weren't any decade defining teams in college sports, really, other than like UCLA. And so it was a difficult period sports wise. And you can see that here, where record sales in the 1970s, in 1973 rather, are more than box office receipts and sports receipts combined. So that's pretty impressive or pretty amazing stat for the popularity of music. All right. Again, just some pictures. You got Kiss up here, the Bee Gees, the Clash, and early popular um, punk band. Casey and the Sunshine Band were another one. Kind of disco / funk music, pop music, something like Helen Reddy, where Donnie and Marie Osmond, very fun, simple, easy, non-aggressive, threatening type music is what came from that. All right, folks, that's going to be it for this week. Next week we'll start on, we'll do a bit of TV, movies, and a couple other things about the 1970s, and that'll be it. So make sure to watch this, and we'll discuss next week when we go over your music sheets. Remember, those are due on Friday. That's about it, folks. Talk to you later.